All these texts. Man, good morning, everyone. We have so many good day texts to share each day. I'm glad I get to do this with you. Thank you for joining me and sharing a part of your morning. So we're going to get right to it because this will conclude, for the most part, or really, essentially, it will conclude. Although we may, well, when I say for the most part, what I mean is, I mentioned the other day when we did one of these videos that we're really dealing with two different accounts. We have the first account, Genesis 1, which gives us a complete view of everything. And then, as we're going to find out in subsequent shows, we come back to this account in part to show in more detail the creation of humankind. So that's coming up. Even though humans have been made, we're going to get to a more detailed account of how we were made. There's not another more detailed account in Genesis of the other creations, but there is one of us, along with other things, as we know, but that we'll look at more closely as part of our day tech shows. Okay, so today's show, we're going to look at Genesis 1. Now, this gets a little tricky. It's from my perspective, okay, in taking on the responsibility of translating, which I do seriously. I spend a lot of time, and I'm serious about presenting what I believe is an accurate translation based on the best available evidence. If other people believe they have better evidence for better translations, go for it. This is what I've come to. And I'm still working on it. But in going through the texts, okay, and reading the texts apart from the typical numbering system, even though I'm familiar, obviously, with the different chapter and verse groupings of the Bible, in translating it, when you're really translating and you're looking at the words and you're trying to gain a sense of the text, you're not looking at numbers and verse groupings, and they're not even in most of the text, some of the printed editions, of course. Like with the Greek Septuagint, I'm primarily using Rolf's edition. But I'm also using the volumes of the Gottingen and other Septuagint editions like Sweet. Any edition that's out there that can potentially contains alternate readings or that might give me an understanding of the best available evidence, I consult. But I haven't done that with every single text, of course. I try to focus on the most reliable printed editions, which in this case are the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the BHS printed copy of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Aramaic texts, and then the Septuagint edition that is printed by Rolf's, or that is known as Rolf's. It's a little blue volume typically. I have it right over here. And then, of course, there are other volumes, but the BHS and Rolf's are usually the most referenced and used complete editions for translators. And I'm bringing this up because the numbering system that I'm using here differs. It's going to differ from probably everyone so far. But that's just the way it is, right? You're getting my understanding based on the best evidence, and I do not believe that starting chapter 2 as if it's somehow disconnected, seems like the intention in many cases, from the preceding account and is more connected with the subsequent creation account of Adam and Eve. I don't think that's accurate, or I just don't see it that way. That's not how I read the text. My reading of the text and my translating the text, and I thought about this, I went over this section a lot because I really wanted to understand the connectivity and where I should stop and start this account. And I don't believe that the first account of creation stops where it typically seems to be indicated in most printed editions of the Bible. So that's why I've extended chapter 1, and that's why I'm labeling today's reading chapter 1, verses 32 through 35. Even though in pretty much every other copy of the Bible you'll find This section will be labeled chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. So, now, one benefit I believe we'll get to in the next day text readings is, well, I'll save the subsequent numbering and textual discussion for the next videos. I don't want to get too far off this one. But because the subsequent readings and the numbering, are part of what I'm talking about, it's easy for me to get off. So just know that my numbering chapter and verse wise for today's text reading is different. And I put the more commonly referred to chapter and verse numbers in brackets so that, even if it's confusing, you should be able to pick it up. So if you're reading from your translation of the Bible and you're not using the translation from the Great Message that I'm doing that's in the description or on my CW Jaw discussion forum site, then just follow along according to the numbering that I put next to what I number the text as. And if you have any questions, you can put it down. There's a note at the end. We'll read it together. Basically, well, it's there at the end. It pretty much covers what I just said. So I don't think we need to read it together. You know how I don't like to read unless it's necessary because we're doing a video. We're supposed to be talking, sharing things, building each other up, and reading's good. We're going to read. But unless it's a text, it's part of our reading, and it's something you can read on your own, I feel you should just read it on your own. Plus, we talked about it. So let's get to the text. Genesis 1, 32 through 35, or Genesis 2, 1 through 4. I'll read both numbers. Let me get my reading breath right. I have a lot to say. And it's early. But I do talk. I talk out loud to get myself going. A little bit. All right, so let's talk together. Genesis 1:32, Genesis 2:1 Hebrew translation. Now the sky heavens. See if you can you should be able to. And I don't mean to stop so quickly. But I think you'll see in the reading why I did not, why I numbered the verses the way I did. Why I connect this part with the prior readings. Okay, see if it makes the same sense to you. Or seems to flow the same way that is connected with the prior texts versus introducing another account. Now the sky heavens and the earth and all of their strong parts were completed. That's the Hebrew translation of Genesis 1:32 or 2:1 if you're using the Great Message. Greek translation Genesis 1:32 or 2:1. So the sky heavens and the earth and everything and all of them were completed. Genesis 1:33 or 2:2 Hebrew translation, during the seventh day God finished his work which he had made, and God stopped working during the seventh day because of all his works which he had made. Now you're going to notice a little difference here in the Greek translation. We'll talk about it. Genesis 1:33 or 2:2 Greek translation, during the sixth day, God completed his works which he made. Then God rested during the seventh day. He rested from all of his works which he made. Genesis 1:34 or 2:3 Hebrew translation, then God began to bless the seventh day, and he began to treat it as sacred, because during that day God had stopped from all his work, which he had created in order to do something good. Genesis 1:34 or 2:3 Greek translation. Then God blessed the seventh day, and he treated it as something sacred, because during the seventh day God ceased from all his works which he decreed to make. Genesis 1:35 or 2:4 Hebrew translation of our last text for today. These are the successive generations or histories of the sky heavens and the earth when they were created, during the time when Jehovah God made land and sky heavens. That's the first use of the full form of the divine name, or of the divine name, period, in the Genesis text. Greek translation of our last text, Genesis 1:35, if you're following me, or 2:4, if you're reading another translation. This is the record of the generations of sky heavens and land, when the time came that Jehovah God made the sky heavens and the earth. I put a note at the bottom, or there's a note in my text on the CWJAW forum. And of course, I've written often about why I use Jehovah in brackets in either the Greek Septuagint text or the New Testament. Because the copies we have more often than not, almost primarily, are after the first century. And all copies of the Septuagint text, which contain a divine name containing text, and that are dated to the first century or earlier, use the divine name, like 4Q Leviticus B. So I put it in brackets because I'm translating the texts that don't actually have them, but that are later than the texts that did have them, and which were likely quoted by those who lived during the first century, at least according to all the evidence we have. Okay, so that's on the divine name. I've written a lot about it. If you want more, just go to D, divine name, on my Elihu Books topical index. But this is the first time the divine name is used in Genesis. Genesis 2:4 or 1:35 in the Hebrew text. Okay, so do you notice this, the last text, verse 35 or verse 4 of chapter 2? These, let's read it again and tell me if you do not agree with me. If you agree with me, then, fine, we move on. And if you don't, it's okay, right? What I'm saying by this verse grouping, the way I'm labeling the text, I'm saying that the first creation account goes all the way to this point. That it doesn't end in Genesis 1:31. So, if there are any questions, let me know. But I think the last text, in fact, even the first one, verse 32 or 2:1, now what's the subject? The sky heavens and the earth and all their strong parts, everything that was done in them. Then it talks about the day in which that was done, right? Now the Hebrew text says seventh day, that's the day when he finished, and the Greek text says sixth day, if you're following Rolf's. But as I mentioned, there's other Septuagint texts, such as the Gottingen text. Now, just because the Gottingen has it doesn't mean that that's the correct reading. So the Gottingen does say seventh day. So Rolf's isn't the only Greek Septuagint text, printed edition, that uses sixth. And I'll put a note that explains what we're talking about now in a little bit more detail when I publish this. But it's not inconsistent, because basically it's just the Hebrew text says that, you could look at it one of two ways. You could look at it that he actually continued partly into the seventh day and stopped during that day. Or it's just saying that once that day started, right? So the sixth day ends, a period of darkness and a time for darkness and a time for light. Okay, now the seventh day begins. God rests. Instead of becoming active, instead of doing something else, he rests. So there's nothing inconsistent about that. In one sense, the Hebrew text is just saying he didn't do any creative activity on that day. The Greek text is saying he finished on the sixth day. So you see what I'm saying? They're not contradictory. Remember, these weren't retards. That doesn't mean they're perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't some minor questions, but this is just two different ways of looking at God's work. One, the Greek text being completed on the sixth day. Two, the Hebrew text, not necessarily in order of priority, but just the views, that the seventh day came, and instead of creating, God rested. And they both say that in verse 33 or verse 2 of chapter 2, that during the seventh day, God rested. So the Septuagint is saying he finished on the 6th, rested on the 7th. The Hebrew text is saying during the 7th day, he rested. He finished. He didn't do anything else. That's how I read that. And that's how it seems fairly obvious. We're just dealing with two different languages. So they're not always going to have the exact same phraseology or description. But they are basically saying the same thing. And then they go on to say the exact same thing. So there's no dispute. And because God rested on that day, he treated it as holy, sacred. Just like you and I do when we go on vacation or we take a break, right? Maybe not as sacred, of course, as this. But what I'm saying is we kind of bless our rest. We treat it as something special. Especially if we've been working hard on something and we're done with it, right? We accomplished our goal. It came out right. It's all good. I'm going to take a break, you know. I'm going to enjoy this. I'm going to watch all this now happen the way I meant for it to happen, so that I can keep blessing it and making it better and benefit all of my sons of God and all the humans, male and female of the earth, and then we'll make more of it, right? That's how I see it. So, but before we get to that, of course, we have other things that happen. Those are our next day text videos. But do you see now why I changed the order of the verses? I realized it was a big risk from the standpoint that people are familiar with it. But I thought, well, it's so obviously connected with the preceding part. Look, and before I talked, I kind of got off on the 7th and 6th day because that was what was next, and I didn't want to miss it. But I meant to also focus on verse 35 or verse 4. I read verse 32, verse 1 of chapter 2. Now the sky, heavens, and earth, and all their strong parts. See, they're in view. Then in verse 35, at the end of this section, what does it say? These are the successive generations of humankind? No. Of the sky heavens and the earth when they were created. During the time when Jehovah God made land and sky heavens. You see, it's referring back. I think all of these printed editions got it wrong. Or they're just not making it as obviously connected as it should be. Wrong may not be the right way to say it, because I'm not sure exactly in every case what the printed editions are intending by their numbering system. But it seems in many cases that the change in the chapter division from 1 to 2 is designed to effectively divide the account or accounts. But I don't think the division is correct. I think this goes all the way to verse 35, what we call 35, or chapter 2, verse 4. And I think it's obvious, especially at the end part. These are the successive generations of the sky heavens and the earth when they were created during the time when Jehovah God made land and sky heavens. It's not talking about humans. They're next. We're next. This is talking about everything preceding it. And just stopping on the 7th day and resting. Not doing any more creative activity like he just did. Now that does not mean that Jah then never did any more creating. How do I know that? 2 ways. While I show you my 2 ways, can you think of a way or an example that demonstrates that Jah kept creating after the 7th day? Not on the 7th day, okay? I'm not saying that. I'm saying after the 7th day. Can you think of an example where Jah created or kept creating? I can. And before I show you that, what I'm going to do is share with you a text that we're all familiar with. Let me pull it up here. John chapter 5. We'll use the NWT for convenience. As you know, I do that because of I haven't translated everything yet, and I'm familiar with it. Okay, so let's take a look at John 5 on this idea of the Sabbath and resting and whether or not that means God ever created again anything. Or does it just mean, like it says, he rested on the seventh day? See, the texts do not say he stopped creating permanently. It just says he stopped creating, realized he did something good, and rested. Okay, so in John 5, the issue of the Sabbath, right? So the Sabbath is directly connected with creation, right? It's directly connected with creation, the resting of God on the seventh day, as we just read in our day text. So this account in John, look at what it says. John 5, it says, the man went away and told the Jews it was Jesus that made him sound in health, someone Jesus healed. And then verse 16, it says, so in this account, the Jews went persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things during Sabbath. And then verse 17, it says, but he, Jesus, answered them, my Father has kept working until now, and I keep working. And of course, we know the Father's actually working through him, right? John 14. But Jesus directly connects this in his response, and so do the Jews. The Jews connect his healing activity. And whether they believe in him being sent by God to heal or healing by the power of Beelzebub or these different things that they accused him of, the point is they associated his works with breaking the Sabbath. And we know they had rules regarding the Sabbath. But then Jesus, he goes outside of the rules for humans on the Sabbath, right? So the Jews were looking at it like he's violating the Mosaic law. Jesus goes beyond that and says that Jah is continuing to work, so he's going to keep working. In other words, he doesn't really have much of a choice. He does, but that would be just to not do Jah's will. So he's not worried about Jah. Jah's the one doing it through him. The one that Jews are saying, you're breaking his laws, you have to be punished. The one who they're saying would punish him is the one giving him this power, telling him to do these things. And so Jesus uses his Father as an example in association with the seventh day or Sabbath rest. Now, the text isn't so clear, right? I mean, we could argue, as I kind of just did, that this really involves the works of the Father, a la John 14, through the Son, which involve healing, resurrection. That's creation of a sort, right? You're recreating part of the body. If, for example, you make Lazarus alive. But let's get to an even better example, right? So the creative activity of God in Genesis involved what? Well, it involved the wind over the waters being pulled back so that land could appear, sky heavens. What does that remind you of? Let me see if any of you got that. I want to check it out here. It reminds me of the flood, right? So what did Jah do during the flood? He basically recreated the whole world, right? Was the world not once again completely covered in water, just like before Genesis, or before the creative action of God over the waters? So the period after God created heavens and earth, the earth was just void with water and wind. Well, that's the earth was still preserved more so because it had sky heavens after the flood, but the heavens were changed, right? So he had to recreate the heavens because now they were not holding as much water as a matter of course. They would not then reabsorb that much water to recreate the same level of canopy. There's not even that much water up there anymore. Most of it's down here now. At least it seems that way. Depends on how much came down. But it appears that sky heavens was changed. We know that he once again did what? He pulled the water back so that land could appear. Same thing that he did in Genesis. It says that the waters rained and then they kept surging. And we'll get to the account. We'll describe all the different days. It was a long time, several months, that the waters and the rain and all this stuff continued and effectively destroyed the earth. If you look at it, which we'll get to in the discussion of the translations of the texts, that involve the flood account. The waters basically destroyed the earth and recreated it exactly the way Jah wanted to. That's why there's so many destroyed remnants. That's why places like Göbekli Tepe are buried in sand. That's why the Sphinx is buried in sand, or was until they found it, right? That's why it has massive erosion all around its sides. And we're talking about massive erosion, like huge amounts of water, similar to what is described in the flood. So that's creation, right? Did he not preserve animals and then use them to multiply again the different species and types? Is he not continuing to change them according to type and environment in ways that he lays down according to each type so that they become useful and grow with their environment, but still don't crossbreed, right? One of the ways we can prove we're not related to any other existing primate, we can't reproduce, right? So this is not just a theory that we're not related to them. Theirs is a theory, right? Their whole theory is based on other theories about theories, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, missing links that they've been caught even trying to create themselves. The point is, you want to prove we're related to any of these primates, prove it. Reproduce. Can't happen. So it's done. This is not an open question. It's over. That's why they need missing links with these other ancient primates that they claim are our real ancestors. It's nonsense. But, when you're taught the way they are and it's repeated to you and your jaw's downplayed and people make light of Genesis, they disparage it for no good reason. They describe it in ridiculous ways when the way it describes, who is it that likely brought us this account? Well, we tend to believe it was Moses, right? That he carried with him traditions that he either obtained through Egypt or through Jah in his discussions with him, and during the time in the wilderness when the angel of Jehovah, Michael the archangel, was with him, teaching him these things, the same way that he taught Daniel through Gabriel and different people of Jah as the angel of Jehovah. So we believe that Moses learned this information from the actual people involved, or I should say, combined it with what he already knew from the records that were contained after the flood, brought down from the people that migrated from eastern Anatolia into Sumer, then Egypt. But the Egyptian creation stories, they're different, right? They don't describe things like the Bible. It does refer to a time known as Tepzepi that I'm not going to get into right now because we're not here to discuss a lot of Egyptian thinking. But that might be the closest thing to a reference to the earliest times described in the Bible. But it's not like Moses, for example, borrowed all the traditional stories of the Egyptians and their gods and the things they believed about them, and the way that the sun and the boat rides and all the different gods that in their view were responsible for what they observed. So why didn't Moses do that? If he felt those were all true and he just disagreed with the Egyptians and their ways of thinking, it's clear something got to him. Some being changed everything for him. Because otherwise it just wouldn't have been, to create that much material, including all those laws and a whole history that's this accurate. You could, I guess, come up with a creation story, sure. But one that's this accurate, one that lays things down in this order properly, that describes things from the creation of all things to then the focusing in on Earth and what it was like, the same way we observe the way other planets are like now when we see them closely. That is incomplete, swirling winds, void. How would he have gotten all that right? It just seems so unlikely that with all that influence from Egypt and their views, to then think, okay, I've got to come up with my own story Well, I'm rejecting all of Egypt. We're taking these people, new stuff. Here's how creation was done. Boom, boom, boom. And he gets it all right? If that's true, then he would be deserving of attention just for that reason alone. But that's not all, right? There's so much more going on. We have all of the histories and stuff. We're just talking about part of it. We're just in one chapter. Genesis chapter 1, according to my text anyway. And even in other print editions, only a few verses more. I just don't think that creation account fits or ends there. I think it ends where I have it, to verse 35, which would be verse 4 of chapter 2 in most Bibles, because it's the record of sky heavens and the land and the earth and the time when Jehovah made them. It's not talking about humans yet. That's next. And that's why I believe you'll see I had good reasons for ending the text here and then starting it next, where we're going to begin as we consider the creation of humans.